I knew something was off the moment I saw the padlock on my shed hanging open, swinging in the breeze like a warning sign. I'm not the paranoid type, but I'm also not the kind of guy who leaves thousands of dollars in tools unsecured. My name's Hayden Ellers. I'm a contractor by trade, and I live in a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that's anything but quiet thanks to the HOA, more specifically, thanks to Clarice Randall, the HOA vice president and full-time neighborhood menace. Clarice had that classic Karen energy mid-50s, bob haircut sharp enough to slice drywall, and an obsession with enforcing rules she made up on the spot. She'd already fined me twice for having my work van too visible in my own driveway. Once she even cited me for leaving my trash can out for 27 minutes past the approved retrieval window. But this time she went too far. I inspected the shed, heart thumping. My Milwaukee drill set was missing. So was my table saw and about $2,000 worth of other equipment. I had installed a motion-triggered camera in the backyard a few months back after someone clipped my extension cord. I rushed inside, pulled up the footage on my tablet, and there she was, Clarice, in broad daylight. Wearing that ridiculous sun visor and floral blouse, using a bolt cutter to snap my padlock like she owned the place. She walked in like it was her personal storage unit, grumbling to herself. I rewound and watched her walk out with my table saw in a wheelbarrow covered with a tarp. I could feel my blood heating. She didn't even try to hide it. She just rolled it right down the sidewalk like she was taking out the recycling. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. The officer who arrived, Officer Delgado, raised his eyebrows when I showed him the footage. "She's part of the HOA," he asked. "Vice President," I said, "and she's been harassing me since the day I moved in." "Looks like we've got enough here to press charges. You want to move forward?" "Absolutely," I said. "She broke in, she stole from me. And she's gonna learn I'm not the guy to mess with." He nodded, took my statement, and told me to hang tight. Within an hour, a cruiser pulled up in front of Clarice's pristine colonial 2 doors down. I stepped out onto my porch just in time to see her arguing with the officers, waving her arms like she was swatting flies. "This is a misunderstanding," she yelled. "I was just inspecting his shed for code violations." "You can't enter someone's property without permission," one of the officers said, "especially not with bolt cutters." "I have authority." "No, ma'am," the officer cut her off. "You don't." "Not like this." They cuffed her right there on her perfect green lawn while half the street watched in disbelief. Her husband, some poor guy named Dale, just stood there holding a poodle and looking like he wanted to crawl into a hole. I didn't say a word. Just stood there with my arms crossed while she was loaded into the car. Clarice Randall had just made the worst mistake of her HOA career, and I wasn't going to let her weasel her way out of it. The next morning, I didn't even get through my first cup of coffee before my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, and sure enough, a message came through. It was from Clarice's attorney, some guy who sounded like he practiced law out of a strip mall between a payday loan office and a vape shop. He said Clarice was eager to amicably resolve the misunderstanding and wanted to avoid unnecessary public spectacle. That ship had already sailed. I wasn't interested in backroom apologies or hush money. I had filed a police report, handed over the footage, and pressed charges. Clarice had been booked and processed. She was facing breaking and entering, theft, and criminal property damage, all felonies. And I had zero intention of letting her wiggle out of that with a half-hearted apology and a gift card to Olive Garden. Instead of calling him back, I forwarded the voicemail to Officer Delgado and emailed it to the Assistant District Attorney's office. Delgado replied within the hour to let me know the DA had picked up the case. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just going to be about getting my tools back. This was going to be about making sure Clarice never pulled this kind of stunt again on me or anyone else. That same day, I got a knock on the door from a woman I'd only seen in passing, Miss Tandy from 3 streets over. She was in her 70s, wore a visor, and walked her beagle like clockwork every morning. "You're the one who caught Clarice, right?" she asked, voice low. I nodded, cautious. "She told us all you were being investigated for illegal contracting," she said. "Said the HOA had to enter your property to gather evidence, even tried to get us to sign some kind of neighborhood petition." I stepped aside and motioned her in. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold. "She's been doing this for years," Miss Tandy said. "My nephew left his dirt bike in my garage during a visit. Clarice claimed it was an unregistered motor vehicle and filed a complaint. I didn't even realize she'd been snooping around the side of my house until I found the gate broken open. I asked if she'd be willing to write a statement. She didn't hesitate. Over the next few days, word got out, not because I spread it, because Clarice's arrest had made the local paper. It was a small column, tucked between a story about a bake sale and a report on a city council meeting, but it was there. And that was enough. The stories started pouring in. One neighbor told me Clarice had once fined them for unsanctioned plant height. Another said she'd taken photos of their backyard without consent. A couple across the street admitted she'd threatened to escalate things to city enforcement when they hosted a birthday party with more than 10 cars parked nearby. I compiled everything: statements, texts, emails, even a few screenshots from the HOA's private Facebook group where Clarice had accused another homeowner of hoarding building materials because they had a pile of lumber behind a privacy fence. I brought it all to the DA's office. My contact there, a junior prosecutor named Nolan, was young, sharp, and had a visible dislike for people who abused their positions. He took one look at the folder and said, "This is starting to look less like a one-off and more like a pattern of targeted harassment." That made things move faster. Clarice's court date was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the HOA board tried to circle the wagons. They sent out a memo claiming Clarice was on medical leave and that the HOA would not comment on internal matters. But by then, her name was mud. 3 board members resigned within days of the memo going out. 2 others stopped showing up to meetings. And when the HOA tried to enforce a new rule about prior approval for all yard decorations, the turnout at the next meeting quadrupled, and not one person was there to support them. People were sick of it. And now they knew they weren't alone. When the court date rolled around, I showed up in clean jeans and a button-down shirt. Clarice arrived flanked by 2 attorneys, both of them looking like they regretted every decision that had led them there. She didn't even look at me. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through BS like a chainsaw through plywood, read the charges aloud. Then she turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Nolan, what do you have?" He laid it out clearly. "The footage, the bolt cutters, the stolen tools, the history of similar behavior, the community statements." Clarice's attorney tried to spin it, claimed she had been acting in the interest of neighborhood safety, that she believed the shed posed a code violation, that she had been under the impression she was allowed to inspect it. The judge raised an eyebrow. "With bolt cutters?" There was an awkward silence. Then, in a move that surprised everyone in the room, Clarice leaned over and whispered something to her attorney. He looked at her like she'd just declared she wanted to defend herself with interpretive dance. He turned back to the judge and said, "Your Honor, my client would like to change her plea to guilty." That got a reaction. The prosecutor blinked. The court reporter paused. Even the bailiff shifted slightly. The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. As this is now a guilty plea, we will proceed to sentencing." Because it was her first criminal offense and because she pled guilty, the sentence wasn't jail time. But she was ordered to pay full restitution for the stolen tools, with an added fine for trespassing and property damage. She was also slapped with a restraining order barring her from setting foot anywhere on my property, including the sidewalk in front of it. But the best part: the judge included a condition. Clarice was to resign from the HOA board immediately and was barred from holding any position of governing authority within a neighborhood association for a minimum of 10 years. She didn't protest, just nodded robotically while her attorney scribbled notes. Outside the courthouse, Nolan caught up with me. "You should know," he said. "We're opening a broader investigation into the HOA. Some of the statements you brought us raise red flags about misuse of association funds and selective enforcement. If we find anything, there could be more charges down the line." I thanked him and walked to my truck feeling lighter than I had in months. Clarice had spent years convincing people she was untouchable, that the HOA gave her the right to control every inch of the neighborhood. But the law didn't agree, and now neither did the people she used to lord over. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something new. A hand-painted sign staked into a neighbor's lawn. It said simply, "We are not her property." That night, we had an impromptu block party. Someone brought a grill, someone else brought folding tables. I supplied the music. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like a place people actually wanted to live. Clarice's house sat dark and silent. No one missed her. 3 weeks after Clarice's conviction, the neighborhood was beginning to breathe differently. You could hear it in the sound of kids laughing in driveways that used to be silent. You could see it in the way people took walks again, waving to each other without glancing over their shoulders to see if someone was taking notes from a window. But I wasn't relaxing just yet. What Clarice had done wasn't an isolated moment, it was the tip of something deeper. The HOA's silence during the entire ordeal bothered me more than anything. Not one official statement to the community. Not a word about policy changes. Nothing. And that meant one thing: they were hoping it would all die down. I'd been compiling documents since the day after the trial. Clarice's arrest had stirred up more than angry stories, it had unearthed receipts. A neighbor named Paul, who worked in IT, dropped off a flash drive with HOA email chains he'd acquired after serving briefly on the board last year. He'd left after 2 months when things got strange, in his words. He hadn't elaborated much, but the emails did. They were a mess. One thread dated back 9 months showed Clarice and the treasurer discussing redirecting discretionary maintenance funds to cover legal consultation expenses over a dispute with a homeowner who'd built a wheelchair ramp without prior approval. That ramp, I later learned, belonged to a retired firefighter with multiple sclerosis. Another email chain revealed that Clarice had been pushing the board to install plate reading cameras at both entrances of the neighborhood. Not for safety, she stated outright that it would help identify non-resident vehicles associated with driveway violations. The cameras were never installed, but budget records showed nearly $8,000 had been withdrawn for security upgrades. Nothing had ever been installed. No cameras, no wiring, not even signage. I printed everything. I sorted it into folders. I checked my facts 3 times, then I made a call to the state attorney general's office. They took it seriously. Within a week, I had an appointment with a state investigator named Margaret Reese. She met me in a government building downtown, tucked between a courthouse and a DMV, the kind of place where the walls were beige and the coffee tasted like carpet. But she was sharp. Asked direct questions. Took notes constantly. "Did you personally witness any misuse of HOA funds?" she asked, flipping through the folder labeled unauthorized expenses. "I didn't, but I've got a list of residents who said they were billed for fines that don't match the bylaws." I also brought digital copies of the emails and the full HOA budget reports for the last 2 fiscal years. She paused. "How did you obtain the budget reports?" "Through the HOA portal. They're supposed to be available to all members." "I downloaded them before they were removed 2 days ago." She looked up then. "They pulled the records." "They did, after I started asking questions." She made a note. "That's obstruction of access. And if funds were misappropriated, we're looking at possible fraud or embezzlement." When I left the office, she walked me out and added, "We'll be in touch. And Mr. Ellers, keep your documentation secure. Don't discuss this with any current board members until we've verified everything." I followed her advice, but the board didn't stay quiet for long. 2 days later, A new HOA president, some guy named Len Holloway, who no one could recall voting for, sent out a letter claiming the HOA had been the victim of a targeted misinformation campaign. The letter accused certain individuals of spreading defamatory material and warned that legal action could be pursued against those perpetuating instability in the community. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. It was vague, defensive, and full of legal fluff. But the message was clear. They were trying to intimidate anyone who dared to speak up, so I went to the monthly HOA meeting. It was held in the community center near the tennis courts. Normally, they were lucky to get 6 people to show up. That night, there were over 40. Folding chairs had to be brought in from the storage room. People were standing in the back. Someone had even brought a legal pad. I waited until the floor was open for community comments. Len Holloway sat at the front table, flanked by the secretary and the treasurer, 2 people I'd never seen before. No one mentioned Clarice, not once. It was like she had been erased from their history. I raised my hand. Len barely looked up. "Yes, Mr. Ellers? I have some questions about the HOA's budget, specifically the $8,000 withdrawn last spring for security upgrades that were never installed." A rustle ran through the room. Len's mouth tightened. "That matter has already been accounted for in our internal audit." I held up a folder. I reviewed the audit. It doesn't list the vendor, the invoice number, or even a line item description. Just says security improvements. Where did the money go? He stared at me. "You're out of order." "This is the community comment period," I replied. "I'm a homeowner. I'm asking a question." Someone behind me said, "Yeah, let him speak," and a few others murmured in agreement. Len exhaled through his nose. "If you have concerns, you can request a private meeting with the board." I did. I sent 2 emails, got no reply. He didn't respond. I turned to face the crowd. "I've already submitted documentation to the state attorney general. If anyone else has records, emails, fines, discrepancies, I encourage you to do the same. We've already seen 1 board member convicted of a felony. I don't think anyone here wants to see that repeated." A woman near the front stood up. She was in her 50s, wore a blue windbreaker, and held a binder thicker than mine. "I've got records," she said. "I served on the board 2 years ago. I resigned when I realized half the votes were being decided before meetings even happened." Another voice chimed in. "I was fined twice for having the wrong mailbox number. Turns out mine matched the one in the bylaws. They never refunded me." Len stood up abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned." But no one moved. Instead, people started sharing stories. One man talked about how his application to build a pergola was denied, despite 3 identical structures being approved on the same street. A couple in the back revealed they'd paid over $300 in late fees for a violation they never received notice of. By the time the board members slipped out the side door, the room was buzzing with people swapping contact info, forming an impromptu coalition. Someone suggested forming a recall committee. Another offered to create a website to track the investigation's progress. I stayed until the last chair was folded. The next morning, I got a call from Investigator Reese. "We've formally opened an investigation into the Willow Glen HOA," she said. "We'll be issuing subpoenas for financial records this week." By the following Friday, law enforcement vehicles were parked outside the HOA's office trailer. Boxes of documents were carried out. Computers were seized. A search warrant was posted to the door. It turned out the financial discrepancies were worse than expected. Clarice and 2 of her former board allies had been funneling funds into a fake vendor account listed as Neighborhood Solutions LLC. The account was registered to Clarice's cousin in another state. Over $23,000 had passed through it in the last year alone. The new treasurer, who'd quietly resigned the morning of the raid, was also implicated. By the end of the month, multiple charges were filed: wire fraud, conspiracy to embezzle, falsifying public records. The HOA board was formally dissolved by court order. A temporary oversight committee was appointed by the county. made up of residents nominated during a community meeting held in the same room where Len had tried to shut me down. That night, as I walked past Clarice's house still dark, the lawn overgrown, I saw something taped to the front door. It was a foreclosure notice. I didn't stop walking. Didn't need to. The neighborhood didn't belong to people like her anymore. It belonged to the people who lived there, who paid their dues and watered their grass and watched each other's dogs when someone went out of town. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been built, piece by people who refused to stay quiet. And this time, no one was backing down. The investigation into the HOA didn't just end with the arrests. It set off a ripple through the entire region. Within 2 weeks, the county's Department of Community Oversight issued a statement confirming they had launched a full audit of every HOA operating under the same umbrella management firm as Willow Glen. Apparently, the corrupt practices Clarice and her crew had used weren't unique. They were part of a pattern that had gone unchecked for years, because no one had ever looked closely enough. That changed now. I stayed out of the spotlight during most of it. I wasn't interested in interviews or recognition. But what I did do was show up at the County Planning Commission meeting with a stack of proposals drafted with help from residents who now called themselves the Willow Glen Reform Committee. We weren't looking for revenge. We wanted safeguards. No more closed-door budget meetings, I told the commissioners. No more vague violation letters, and definitely no more HOA board members who think they can play judge, jury, and locksmith. There was a pause after I spoke. The head commissioner, a woman named Marissa Doyle, tapped her pen against the desk before saying, "We've been receiving complaints from other neighborhoods too. Yours just happened to be the first to bring documentation." She asked for a copy of our proposals. We handed them over. And then we waited. Meanwhile, the legal cases against Clarice and the others moved forward. The prosecution presented evidence that showed a years-long scheme of misappropriation, intimidation, and falsified records. It turned out Clarice had even gone so far as to create fake violation notices to justify fines that were never deposited into the HOA's bank account, but instead into an alternate account she controlled under a shell entity. The forensic accountant hired by the state found over $34,000 in diverted funds across multiple years. Clarice had used the money for landscaping upgrades to her own property, a luxury kitchen remodel, and even a few weekend getaways charged under neighborhood development conferences. The judge didn't need much convincing. At sentencing, Clarice stood in front of the same courtroom where she'd pleaded guilty weeks earlier, now facing the full weight of state charges. Her attorney tried to argue that she had been under considerable stress and was acting with misguided intentions, but the judge wasn't having any of it. "You violated the trust of your entire community," the judge said. "You used your position not to protect your neighbors but to exploit them. That is not poor judgment. That is calculated misconduct." She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution not just to me, but to every resident who had been fined under false pretenses. The total came to just under $40,000. The other 2 board members received suspended sentences and were barred from serving on any residential board or financial body for the next 15 years. Clarice's house, already in foreclosure, was seized to cover part of the restitution. By the time the dust settled, the HOA that had once terrorized the neighborhood was gone, dismantled from the foundation up. One of the oddest moments came 2 days after sentencing. I stepped outside to grab the mail and found Dale, Clarice's husband, standing on the sidewalk in front of my house. He kept his hands in his pockets and stared at the grass like it owed him an apology. "I didn't know what she was doing," he said without looking up. "She didn't talk about any of it. I just thought she was running meetings, arguing about lawn colors or whatever." I didn't say anything. "I should have paid more attention," I nodded once. "Probably," he looked at me then. You ever need help with anything? I don't know, moving lumber or fixing a fence. I'm retired, I got time, I'll keep it in mind. He walked off without another word. I didn't watch him go. The neighborhood took time to rebuild, not physically, but emotionally. For months, people were cautious about anything that looked like structure. We agreed not to form another HOA, at least not one with enforcement powers. Instead, we created a neighborhood council, purely voluntary, for organizing block parties, garage sales, and snow removal schedules. And it worked. People who had once avoided each other's eyes now stopped to chat on evening walks. A group of teenagers started a lawn service, and nobody called them in for using gas-powered mowers. Halloween was the biggest it had ever been. I counted over 100 kids in costume, and not one parent worried about whether their decorations were approved. One afternoon in early spring, I got a call from Marissa Doyle, the commissioner. "I wanted you to know," she said. "We've passed a new ordinance." She explained. Every HOA in the county was now required to submit quarterly financial disclosures to an independent agency. Any violation of that rule would result in automatic suspension of board powers and a full audit. The ordinance had passed unanimously. "You started something bigger than you realize," she said. "You didn't just fix your neighborhood, you gave us the push to fix a broken system." I thanked her and hung up. Then I walked out to the shed, the one Clarice had broken into, the one she thought she had the right to enter. It was freshly painted now, with a new reinforced lock and a security camera mounted just above the door. My tools were back in place, most of them replaced with restitution money. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that it was mine. Not just the shed, but the space around it. The yard. The house. The neighborhood. We had taken it back, and no one, no matter how many titles they gave themselves or how many rules they invented, was going to take it from us again.